Okay.
Hello, everybody. My name is Susanna Dinage, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Kate Silverton to you today. She needs no introduction, of course, but I know, Kate, you were very sorry not to be able to attend the Childcare and Education Expo in Coventry this weekend. So it's really fantastic. We've got this opportunity to just touch on a couple of the points you were going to make in your session, and also to answer some of the questions that have been sent in to people were hoping to attend. So without further ado, I'll get on, but maybe you'd just like to say a word of introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Susanna. And again, my sincere apologies. I've been so looking forward to this. It's my passion, as many of you may know, in terms of childcare and early years. So I really had hoped to be there. And I hope maybe that I can get to the next one or one in London to see you all soon. But really delighted. Thank you very much for joining us for this video.
Fantastic. So obviously the audience and all of you guys that are watching this video are in the world of early years education, which is obviously brings its challenges. And Kate, the topic really around your planned talk on Saturday was going to be around the neuroscientific basis of children's behaviours. And of course, this is what your books are all about. There's no such thing as naughty. There's still no such thing as naughty. And really helping people to understand really the way a child's brain's developed in those early years. Can you just talk a little bit about your books, why you wrote them, and why you believe that there is no such thing as naughty?
And so we know there's not, based on the science. And I think that the science has been around for a very long time, but it's only just really starting to gain traction. And it's really just ignited this passion within me, because once we know how our children's brains develop, we suddenly see their behavior in a completely different context. So it's really important for us all to know that our brains, all of our brains, develop in stages. So with the more primitive parts of the brain developing first and the more sophisticated parts of the brain developing last. The part of our brains that allows a child to regulate their feelings, to really consider the world from another child's perspective, or even your perspective, when you're caring for them, that part isn't fully developed until our children are in their 20s. So it really, really puts into stark context of why we cannot judge children by our own standards, because they're operating in the world with a very different brain, really, because it's not fully functioning yet. So we cannot view preschool children as the finished article, because they are far, far from it. So it's really why anyone with a role caring for children really has to consider ourselves in the brain development business, because how we act around, how we respond to children is really having an important impact on their brain development. And it's also having an impact on their body, on their physical health, specifically their nervous system. So this is where it gets really interesting, because we now know that the way we all really navigate the world is not from here, but from within here, starts in here. It's our nervous system. And our nervous system responds in a flash to what's going on in the environment. If there was a noise outside now, I would be responding from a physical sense, even before I'd cognitively thought, oh, is that the postman or is that somebody outside? My nervous system is ready to respond, because that's how we're all designed. We are designed for survival first and foremost. And children are operating in the world with their more primitive parts, so the nervous system, the brainstem, cerebellum, and then the limbic system. Really, from that bit, then it stops. They don't have that fully developed prefrontal cortex that allows them to think, oh, what was that noise then? Was that the postman? Do I need to be worried about that? They don't have that. So they literally react in an instant. So it's why if a door slams in nursery, you'll see children sort of startle. That's their primitive brain and nervous system responding to what might be a threat. It sees a burst of cortisol and adrenaline. The sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and that needs to come back to balance before a child can then sit and feel relaxed. So I'll stop in just a second, Susanna, but I'm trying to give that big whole, that sort of whole holistic really picture. for understanding our children, particularly mindful in the nursery setting, because some children's nervous system will be used to noisy environments. They might have had parents who then soothe. If there was a dog barking, if there was a lot of noise, the parent would step in and soothe. And the brain and the nervous system starts to go, oh, okay, things happen in the world that feel a bit scary, but actually everything's okay. But some children don't have that. And more than that, they might have been in environments that are frightening. So that can see a child much more readily in fight flight, which is where we get that very erratic behavior that can be more difficult to understand and to deal with. So really, in short, understanding how to work with children whose nervous systems have been triggered is vital if we are to see sort of calm, regulated behavior at nursery and preschool. And understanding brain development really helps us to understand children's behavior in an instant. I'm not saying it's easy, but once we understand it, and I'm very happy to explain the concept, Susanna, but I'll stop talking now because I hope that gives a sort of initial sense of there's a lot more going on than we might have thought.
Absolutely. And I think that whole conversation around the nervous system is just so important, isn't it? And there's two aspects at play here: is the child itself and how we can help the child self-regulate. If you could talk a little bit about that. And again, I know in the books you talk about helping some of the children understand their big feelings and how they can begin to self-regulate. And then I want to come on to how people, who are working, educators in this space can help children regulate too. So can you
So
talk a little bit about, well, in whichever order you like, children
yes.
learning to self-regulate maybe?
I think in terms of the support that adults can offer children in that early years setting is absolutely vital, because first of all, what can we do then as adults to support the child? Because children cannot easily self-regulate. They have to learn that. They only learn that by having it modeled to them. So ideally, when our babies are born, they're very much driven by what I sort of liken as a little lizard, a very sort of erratic little lizard. It doesn't really think, it just does. It either goes into fight, flight, freeze. It tells us with the baby will say, I'm hungry, so I'll cry. That's the main form of communication. And that's operating really from the very primitive parts of the brain and the nervous system. Then it comes sort of that more the baboon, which is the very emotional behavior. And only then the prefrontal cortex is what helps with self-regulation. Well, if I tell you that a child's brain and that prefrontal cortex, what I call the wise owl, doesn't actually really come online until a child is around 3, 2.5, 3. This is the work of Dr. Bruce Perry. That's what we understand. So most children under 3 are really navigating the world. They're not able to self-regulate easily. If we think about it as adults, how do you self-regulate? Many of us might pick up a drink or a cigarette or food or whatever. We all self-soothe, self-regulate, often in very unhelpful ways, but that's us as adults. But we recognize the need to soothe ourselves. We might go for a run, might go for a walk, great. But our children haven't learned any of that yet. So they find it very difficult because their fight flight response comes in and then their nervous system is triggered. So they need us to help them to regulate. So what can adults do to offer children support in early years settings? Understand the science, read my books, not just on a sales pitch here, but just my books have been written for time poor people, myself included, to understand the science in a very simple way, but it really helps to explain how the brain develops and how to soothe a dysregulated child. Lots of books, and I can talk in a little bit about the other books that I might recommend. Also consider the environment in the classroom or the nursery. Does it feel chaotic? Is there a lot of shouting? Are children hitting each other, screaming, crying? We know it goes on, right? Because you've got lots of small people running around. But what might be sort of less distressing to adults, or what we might have become used to, we've got the benefit of a fully developed prefrontal cortex. So actually we can kind of think, oh, they're all just hungry, we're going to get them to sit down in a minute, or whatever the reasoning might be, or the self-soothing might be. But children don't have that ability. So when it's a chaotic environment, when there's a lot of screaming and running around, it can feel and be experienced not by all children, as I say, but it can feel extremely frightening to a small child. Even the fire alarm going off will trigger the stress response. That's what it's designed to do, right? To have us respond. But whereas we might go, right, everybody, line up outside, we're all fine. It's just the sort of a test. Well, that child's nervous system doesn't know that. It just knows something bad's going off and I need to respond to it. So you're going to get bigger, more erratic behavior. So understanding that and understanding that the world is generally can be a bit stressful. So our children will experience stress, but understanding our role is in helping them to de-stress thereafter, simply because they don't have that fully developed brain capacity to do it for themselves just yet. And I know you're probably going to ask me then, what do we do? But I'll let you go to the next question because I can give you some practical tips.
And again, and I really would recommend, again, not on a sales pitch at all, but I think in your books, the way you personify this in a lizard, a baboon, and a wise owl, and it's so, in the way you talk about it, so straightforward to understand those different parts of behavior and the levels of response from a child. So I could understand it. So I really would recommend somebody reading that. It makes complete sense. We have some questions that have been sent in by the people on this video, so maybe we could go to those because I think they will really get to the crux of the matter, if that's all right. What ways can we support children in an ever-changing world? I think that really speaks to what you've just talked about, that the world isn't predictable, it is stressful, there is a lot of noise, there's a lot of unpredictability. How can we support children in an ever-changing world as people who are there to educate them and be with them in these early years?
So we need to consider the world from the child's perspective. And yes, the world can be chaotic and stressful, shouldn't actually be like that and unpredictable. And in these first few years of life, as adults, we can cope with it just about. But for children in this first few years, actually, and I know many of you would obviously already know this, but in terms of predictability and a containing environment, that actually feels very safe. So that's always to be supported. Thinking about the environment is really key. When we consider that children were typically raised in hunter-gatherer communities where they enjoyed the support of 19 other adolescents and adults who were all there invested in their development. So even if mum and dad were working away, all of those 19 were there to soothe any fright or offer a socializing force with boundaries around behavior, offered with good humor and compassion. So that was a really good model for sort of supporting children when we recognize today that we're often operating at a ratio of perhaps one adult to maybe 4 children or more. So their social environment is less enriched. And not only that, but they're having to navigate a lot of other naturally dysregulated small people who also need support too. So just being mindful allows us to then look at our children when they're in this dysregulated state. If they have been triggered, we can then think not what's wrong with you, which is a tendency that we can all fall into. What's wrong with you? Why are you doing that? Actually, we've got to stop and think, actually, I wonder what's going on for you right now. And then how might I help? That's absolutely key, to see children from their perspective, reacting to their environment and seeing our role in it if we are going to see good, healthy future brain development and i.e. good future mental health.
So again, in your books, you talk about some very practical tips of getting down with children, in those moments of big emotion. Can you talk, again, this is very complicated settings for educators where there's a lot of children around, but can you maybe talk about a couple of examples about, when a child really is exhibiting big behavior or some kind of emotional distress or a strong reaction to something? Can you give a couple of practical examples of how an educator might support a child in that moment?
Absolutely. So again, understanding the stress response, understanding that a child who is dysregulated is in the middle of what we call the stress response, that fight flight behavior. It might even be flop. Very difficult for us when we are trying to manage more than one child. Absolutely. But the first thing is that thing of how might I help, and soothing. We can soothe children with our voice. We can soothe them with our presence. So we're not going to sort of trigger that stress response even more by leaning over and sort of being really, really big. not forgetting what it is to be human. And yes, I work very closely in safeguarding, as you might imagine, when I'm working clinically. I appreciate the potential barriers, but soothing a child can come in the form of maybe offering, and I'm sure you already do it, but there's teddies to cuddle, or a yoga bolster is a really good one to get a child to really squeeze and sort of feel that lovely sort of connection. We can put a cushion between us, again, based on your own safeguarding environment and your own policies, but often a cushion, a big cushion between you and the child for them to hug, whatever your nursery or school agrees. Get down onto the child's level, showing empathy for their distress. Because when a child is in distress, we know that big emotions, disappointment and the sorrow and loss, grief, if parents have just left the child, these big emotions are felt in the same parts of the brain as physical pain. So we might ask ourselves, what would I want if I fell over in front of everybody and hurt myself? Would I want someone to go, come on now, get up, or whatever? Or would I want someone who's going to show concern for me and help me? So it's often in that just being very human. Now, so soothing is very good for, for children where you instinctively feel that will work. Very dysregulated children, we're going to meet them where their energy's at. Wow, you are showing me how cross you are right now. We're going to go up. I talk about it in the book. I do lots of scripting in terms of meeting children. I work with a lot of dysregulated children. I am working one-to-one, so that makes a big difference, clearly. But what we want to do is to bring that child down. And I liken it to a child that's in distress as skydiving. So they're sympathetic, S for skydive, S for sympathetic. Sympathetic nervous system has been triggered. It is the equivalent for them, their bodies, as if they're in mid-flight without a parachute. So we want to be the instructors, fly in alongside, sort of not literally, obviously, but to be alongside that child, meet them where that energy is at. And then we want to work on bringing them back down. So we want to pull the parachute, the parasympathetic nervous system. And I show lots of lovely ways to do that. Now, let me just give you a few because we're rattling through. I know we're not sort of doing full time here, but physical activity can be a really good way. So for a child that's in really big distress, we want to meet their energy where they're at and we want to bring them down. And that is with that soothing and really I really want to understand you. And it's okay, sweetheart, I'm here. Because a child that's in distress does not feel safe. So the best thing we can do is to really think, how can I help this child to feel safe right now? And you'll use your own intuition, your own training and experience to be able to do that. What can be really helpful before we get to that big dysregulated behavior is to actually help all children to get rid of the fizz that they might be feeling naturally, especially when they come through the door. They might be bringing all sorts of experience with them when they walk through the door that morning. They might have had, mum or daddy's late. There might have been a bit of shouting. They might have forgotten something. They might be distressed that mum's going to be going away for a day, whatever it might be. They're bringing that energy in, that stress response in. So, and again, I know lots of wonderful nurseries and preschool that do this in terms of having some music, dancing, star jumps, lots of laughter, letting children run around to discharge the energy that they're bringing in. Children are designed to move. That's what we know, that animals shake out their stress response. Humans are actually the only animal alongside zoo animals that have forgotten how to shake out our stress response. So it's a very natural process. So allowing children to move, I've had colleagues who've had children. I work a lot with looked after children. So if we have a child who's very dysregulated when they come in, actually doing a quick obstacle course is enough to bring that big energy back down. It triggers a parasympathetic, then we all want to come back down again. So it's recognizing that there is this energy cycle with children. And if they are triggered, they're bringing in lots of energy. We want to meet them there, and then we want to bring them back down. And again, I share lots and lots of ways for people to be able to do that.
That's amazing. One of the questions we've had is, can you suggest some good self-regulation techniques that they can show the children? Because obviously educators can't be there all the time with every child. Again, can you give a couple of tips or ideas where, I mean, I know you have your butterfly hug, which I personally love. Is there anything, or are these children just, is it a little bit much to ask them really to self-regulate? I think that's something that maybe
Yeah,
we,
I think so. There's two things going on here. It's how many of us are really good. I know I'm not. I might reach for a piece of cake over going, oh, I must do a butterfly hug. So yes, I can show you the butterfly hug. That's amazing. And in that moment, but when we are in a setting with very young children, we have to model the behavior. We have to model it. We have to sit alongside that child. It's too much to expect them to do it alone. There will be some children who will curl up in a ball. There will be some children who will self-soothe in other ways. And that might be appropriate depending on what experience they've had, because as parents, we're constantly helping our children to self-regulate. If I'm walking my baby in the pram and a dog lunges, I'm going to go, oh, sweetheart, it's okay. I'm going to pick my baby up and I'm just going to jig them. And they're going to log that in their brain for like, oh, okay, all right, it's okay. So they are learning from year dot, as it were, but it is still too much to really expect children. We can show them the butterfly hug. Again, I talk about it in the book, and lots of people will do breathing exercises, but in that moment of fright or distress, it's really hard. So we have to then model it. And again, I know, because I work in schools, I know that a lot of teachers will sit and do that, but it is hard. So we might just need to be mindful of how many can I handle at this time, and maybe I'm going to take three these dysregulated, and we'll do the children together. But stress is contagious. So we do need to be really, really on it with this sort of soothing, because otherwise, you get one child dysregulated and it can trigger, as you'll know, contagious with others, the same way that we can all do it as adults as well.
So again, it may be a little bit of a difficult question to answer, but someone's asking, from what age can a child self-regulate, do you think, or begin to self-regulate?
Yeah. So when we consider that the part of the brain that allows us to regulate and to have what Dan Siegel, the neuropsychiatrist, calls good vertical integration, where our sort of wise owl can swoop down, in my analogy, and scoop up the lizard and the baboon, and sort of hug them and soothe them. That part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, doesn't actually fully come, it doesn't fully come online until we're in our 20s, but it doesn't even come online until we think around 2.5, probably more like 3 years old. So when we think children under 3 are kind of wandering around the world without the benefit of this really amazing part, but it is there. It is there from birth and it's developing. So the more we practice that self-soothing, the more likely that child is to sort of get that sense of, oh, I do feel better when I'm rocked. I mean, children are quite instinctive, actually. Children might jump up and down as a way of self-soothing. Children might rock back and forth as a way of self-soothing. So it's instinctive within them. But let's just sort of cut them some slack when they get things wrong, because they will, because they don't have a fully developed brain just yet. So we're not going to punish them for that. My goodness, it's a bit like saying, if you get, we don't punish a child for getting their spelling test wrong. So I hope we don't punish them when they get their behavior wrong, because they're still learning. And even us as adults are still learning. So we have to model that behavior. Think about under 3, they really do need us. And there's a bit of research that I read that said a toddler needs help with their self-regulation now let me get this right, because you'll probably want to know, I think it's every 20 seconds. It's something that sounds absolutely bonkers, but I'm fairly certain it's something like 20 seconds. I need to go and have a look that up, but just that blew me away. It just shows you that throughout the morning, a child might be going, oh, my stress response has been triggered. Oh, it's going to have to come back down again. Oh, here it goes again, because someone's taken my favorite toy or someone's bonked me over the head by accident, whatever it might be. A lot happens in our settings, in our school and childcare settings. So being mindful of that and trying to mitigate as much as we can. I get that it almost feels like an impossible task, particularly with the ratios that we work with, but knowing this, I think, can help, I hope, make our lives easier and certainly our children happier.
Right. So self-regulation obviously is a long process, but we have to be realistic, think about the nervous system, and just making sure those behaviors are being exhibited by the adults around them will propel that more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, watching adults say, you know, if we can sort of say, I say with my children, oh, I'm feeling a bit nervous, I'm going to shake it out. I'm going to shake it out. So all the things that you do so wonderfully in nursery anyway, we can use that and go, oh, who feels nervous today? We got whatever it might be, you know, being playful and then having a little clap or a tambourine. It's showing children, oh yeah, I can link how I'm feeling with actually doing something that makes me feel better. So there's lots of ways of modeling the behavior we want to see, and also all the time just being mindful of like, what is this? Is this helping a child come back to homeostasis, their parasympathetic nervous system and their sympathetic nervous system coming back to balance together?
Fantastic. So I want to sort of end actually on language and parents, which are all obviously part of this mix. Again, a couple of questions that have come in. So, what language should be used rather than things like naughty or that's bad behavior? And how can we get parents to join us in changing our language around that?
Okay. So rather than naughty, why don't we start thinking about what's really going on and name it? It's distress. A child, distress and need. So if I'm acting out, and we all hear that phrase, all communication, all behavior is communication, and it really is. When children, especially when they're frightened, they will behave in ways that are often very erratic, and that can be perceived as naughty, but that is actually distress. So science shows us that the child is experiencing literally within their bodies a neurochemical wildfire. Adrenaline, cortisol, everything is designed to say either go into fight or run, flee, or flop or faint. So that is a child who's in a state of overwhelm. And so, I mean, there's lots of different behaviors. Oh, what about the child that puts their hands on the wall? So we can talk about boundaries. Absolutely. So I welcome big behavior in the therapy room. I welcome that because that's my job, is to help children with that. But I'll still have boundaries. There is still like, okay, we can paint our hands. It's amazing as we can put our hands on the paper. We don't put it on the walls. So we can put boundaries in around behavior. So we're not getting naughty behavior. We are containing the children to say, this is appropriate, this is not. But actually, if a child is doing something that might seem erratic and frustrating and infuriating to us, step back and just think what might be going on, because this child might well be in distress. Their nervous system might be driving this. I think it's just understanding for parents to really understand the science. I've written my books to be super, super simple because I've worked with a lot of families. They say, Kate, make that science simple because otherwise we won't read it. 3 animals and a tree helps anyone and everyone to understand ourselves as much as our children and to ensure good future mental health.
And I think you've just answered our last question, actually, which was, are there any resources we can direct parents towards to help educate them on supporting their child's behaviour? And I have to say, you know, personally, again, I thought that was a really fantastic overview of the work you've done. I think there's some great tips in there, but the 2 books, there's no such thing as naughty, and there is still no such thing as naughty. I think they go up to 11, 12 years old. You're
Yes.
covering that whole age group to understand how a child is evolving and maturing over those years, and how, adults can support children as they mature. It's full of practical tips, but actually really importantly, as you've said, the science. If you understand the science, everything else seems to make more sense, and how we respond to that makes more sense. So I'm going to answer that question myself for the person who said, are there any resources? I highly recommend your books.
I might add in, if I'm allowed, obviously my books I would thoroughly endorse, but in my books I also include a lot of brain boxes and resources at the back as well, and references, because my work, I'm a former journalist and broadcaster, so I've come to this. I mean, I've been working in this field for a very long time, but actually there are amazing people. So the work of Dr. Margot Sunderland, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, Dr. Bruce Perry, Peter Levine, Dr. Gabor Mate, they're all colleagues now. of mine, which is a wonderful thing, but it's their work that has helped me to understand all of this. As a journalist, I'm literally distilling Professor Peter Fonagy. I'm distilling all of the science that they have brought over decades and decades. So I know everyone's thirsty for sort of, academic resources, and Margot Sunderland does amazing books as well for children. So I hope people can take those down as well. But if not, they are all in my books, and I reference all of them because they're the people that I've learned from, and that have taught me.
And one final thought from you, Kate, for all these people who are working with the early years group. Any final kind of thoughts or
I
comments?
think, look, we all go into this job with joy, and I know it's not easy. I mean, I have 2 young children myself, and 1 parent and 2 children is hard enough. So I do get the challenges. I think a lot needs to change in terms of the recognition. I also speak a lot in the second book about the recognition that I think needs to be given for early years education. I mean, it's absolutely bonkers that we don't have more investment and more recognition. And it's saluting the work that you do genuinely, because you're at the forefront. And we all know now that the first few years, indeed the first 5 years, I would say, are absolutely fundamental for good future mental health. So why are we not investing in the same way that we end up doing, putting money in the secondary school years when the wheels start to come off? So I am doing all I can to raise awareness, sort of with policymakers, and I'm doing all I can because I believe in the work that you're doing. I know how important it is as a parent, and I also know how difficult and challenging it can be, especially right now. So know that you're doing a good job. If you've gone into this field, then thank you. And on behalf of all the children that you look after, thank you too.
Thank you so much, Kate. Hope that was useful to everybody.